Stories, whether they be factually true or symbolic, nevertheless, often still have an awful lot to teach us. And so it is with this story that we read from St. John's Gospel, the story of the Samaritan woman. And the most important thread for me running through that story is that here is a woman who is so gobsmacked by what she has seen and heard that she wants to run and tell her friends about it so that they too can come and have a look. And she goes, and of course they're skeptical. But she says, "Come on, I'll show you." So they can see and hear for themselves. And then, when they were able to do that, they were convinced. And that is what our theme is today, finding out for yourself. This is crucial to our understanding of faith in this century. For centuries, churchgoers have blindingly accepted what the institution has told them. So that when Galileo and Copernicus in the 16th century said that the earth was not the center of the universe, the sun was. And when Galileo said, well, the earth is not flat, it is round, the church excommunicated him for what they thought was undermining the faith. And the followers of the church took the way of the institution of the church, not the way of a genius mathematical scientist. And it's only a few years ago, in 1992 in fact, that the Catholic Church finally rescinded that excommunication. I'm sure they were pretty well pleased with that, was Galileo, still like 400 years too late. The church, you see, was preventing people from thinking for themselves. So let's reflect for a moment. How do we find things out? Well, first of all, we can read or listen or watch the media. This week, you might have noticed a well-known television broadcaster of the past, Dan Webb. Some of you might remember him. He died this week. And amongst his many accomplishments as a news and sports presenter, he was responsible for the great April Fool's Day spoof. Some of you might remember that. Spaghetti trees, he said, were being affected by a very dangerous epidemic called spagworm, which threatened to wipe out the whole of the spaghetti industry. He actually nicked that story from somebody 10 years previous in the BBC. Somebody else you might also remember, a very, very famous television presenter, Richard Dimbleby, who presented a prestigious documentary program called Panorama. It was Richard Dimbleby who did the commentary on the coronation and on Winston Churchill's funeral, a very somber and serious voice presenting serious matters. Well, he did on April 1st, he did the spaghetti spoof as well. And millions of people in both the UK and in Australia were devastated by that news. The TV networks were absolutely deluged with people ringing. What can they do to prevent this impending disaster? They believed it. Then again, the media themselves can be completely fooled. Only last week here in Victoria, Channel 9 reported on what appeared to be a dangerous incident outside Melbourne Magistrates Court. And Deborah Knight, Channel 9 news presenter, and I quote word for word what she said on the main news. She said, "Rival extremist groups have clashed outside the Melbourne Magistrates Court over the appearance of the controversial leader of the United Patriots Front." And Peter Mitchell also on Channel 9 repeated that through the day's news cycle. It was a demonstration, it appeared, between the hard right and the hard left really having a go at each other, which was resulting in violence. However, the whole thing was a satirical spoof. If you looked closely at what some of the demonstrators were waving as Australian flags, they weren't Australian flags at all, they were making up flags. And you could see, when you actually looked closely, that it wasn't true, and the so-called protagonists set it up between them to make a satirical point. But people believed it because it was presented by a very serious and authoritative news journalist. This is what President Trump calls fake news. Although I think my definition of such would be pretty different to his. But nevertheless, that's what it's all about. Well, we say, well, what do we believe? Are there things that we can believe? Are there things that we can read and believe? Well, we can believe the Bible, can't we? Because that's God's word. Well, does that make sense to you? I don't think so. I was talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago who told me that her husband and herself had banned those little plastic toys, the dinosaur toys, a collection. She'd banned their children from playing with them because dinosaurs never existed. And I asked her why dinosaurs never existed, and she said, well, of course, they're not in the Bible, and they weren't referred to in the Garden of Eden. And I cringed, as you could imagine. I went away, and I asked a fundamentalist friend of mine who does actually have a literal view of the Bible like that lady, and I said to him, what about these dinosaurs? How could he explain all the thousands of fossils that exist in the world, not to mention the huge reconstruction of bones in the likes of the Natural History Museum, and other huge numbers of examples of that in different parts of the world. And he said to me, I just went away, I too was gobsmacked when he said this. He said, yes, he said, we don't deny those. God put those fossils there to test our faith. What? I'm reminded of a book written by J.B. Phillips many years ago, the title of which was Your God is Too Small. That is so limiting. Of course, what we have to do with the Bible when we read it is to understand it in terms of how it was written, how it came together, how it was compiled, what were all the different influences and intentions behind it. And that's why in worship, I would often talk about those things, because only then can we truly understand what it's saying, because otherwise they're meaningless. So, in order to find out truth, we can't actually depend entirely on what we read, listen, or view. Another way of finding stuff out is from what other people tell us. When I was thinking about this April Fool's Day spoof, I was reminded of many, many years ago when I was much more adventurous in the services that I conduct, and it was April Fool's Day, and it was a full church, and I was the minister of that church, and there was a big group of people who were there for a baptism who don't normally come to church, and I walked into the center of the church like I did today, and I stood at the front of the church, and I said to the whole congregation, "Look," I said, "I had a real bad night last night. I'm really not up to conducting the service this morning, so we'll just cancel it. Can you all come back next week?" And then I walked out. And there was this wonderful moment of just a few seconds. And half the congregation who knew me were still not a bit sure about it, but the poor baptism families, they just absolutely blown apart. And of course, then I shouted from outside the church, "April Fool." But just for a moment, they believed me. Why? Why would you? Well, because I'm an authoritative person. I'm dressed up in a frock and I look important. And I'm the minister. Of course, he only ever says the true things, doesn't he? So that's, well, do you always believe what people tell you? One of the hobbies in my life that I've always had is keeping tropical fish. I love tropical fish. I've had them from a child. And I've always had big fish tanks in my offices, and one's coming here soon. It's on its way. And those beautiful angelfish and Siamese fighters and guppers and tetras and all the rest of them. And I remember one fish that I wanted more than anything else. It is known as an upside-down catfish. Why is it an upside-down catfish, you ask? Well, it looks just like an ordinary, pretty miserable fish, except that this fish actually swims upside down. And I went to this very expensive and expert tropical fish shop, and I bought my upside-down catfish. And I said to the man in the shop, "But it's not upside down." "Oh, no," he said, "that's because I've only just put it in the tank, and it needs to settle down." So I took it home, and every day I looked into my tank. Sure enough, this perfectly happy fish was swimming around, but it wasn't upside down. I went back to the man time and time again. I said, "What's happened to this fish? It's not upside down." "Oh, it will. It'll be upside down, I promise you." "All right," I said. So I went back home, and eventually I got up one morning, and I looked in my tank, and there it was. It was upside down. It was dead. He really took me for a ride, didn't he? I believed him because he repeatedly told me, because I thought he was the expert. Sometimes when you see things, even when you're with somebody, you see things a bit differently. I remember I was with my wife once, and we were driving, and we were stationary, parked at traffic lights. And a man walked in front of my stationary car, and as he walked in front, not looking to the outside lane, another car came and hit him as he walked out in front of it. And so I was a key witness. The guy was injured, but he recovered okay. But there was a court case, and I had to go to court as a key witness, as did my wife. And we went to court. And we never really talked about it much. We'd both been sitting there next to each other until we got to court. And then when we were both asked what we saw. And I explained what I saw, that the man had come from this side of the road and walked in front of the car. And my wife got up and she said, "No, he didn't. He came from the other side of the road." And that was it. We were both sitting there and we were both absolutely convinced that what we saw was right. We saw the same thing completely differently. You only have to talk to people at a footy game, don't you, to get a first-hand report of the game from opposing supporters. You'd think you were at completely different games, wouldn't you? You see things differently. Or, if we really want to find stuff out, we find it for ourselves. And this, for me, is the heart of our faith. Our spirituality, our understanding of the ground of our very being. We have to experience it and understand it ourselves. Paul Tillich argues strongly that all understandings of faith, or our theology, if you like, must be grounded in real-life human situations. Even the very word God itself, God, using that term, distances ourselves from the very concept we are trying to grasp, because it is loaded with all sorts of assumptions. And the more we place God out there and beyond us and supernatural, the more we are denying our own reason, our own intelligence, our own experience. Another great theologian, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, would say, God is not out there on the borders of life. God is clearly in the midst of our life. Paul Tillich goes on to say that we are so conditioned by the word God as being out and beyond somewhere, that what we have to do is we have to forget completely all our traditional understandings that we've learned about God, and that perhaps we should dispose of the very word itself in that process. And this then comes down ultimately to what is your own experience and your own, my own reasoned understanding. And I'm not here talking about what's often described as a personal God, because that is restricting, that's putting God in our box. I'm talking about what we can see and feel for ourselves in our relationships with each other in the world, of which we are just one small part. And this is what Deborah last week, when we had that conversation, we remember, was talking about when she expounded on the concept of love. That's the heart of it. Theological statements are not a description of the highest eternal out there being, but an analysis of the depths of our own personal relationships, an analysis of all our own experiences interpreted by love. This, then, ultimately is down to us to work out for ourselves. Because you can read all the theological textbooks in the world, you can listen to all the preachers and ministers spouting on, even me. If it doesn't make sense to you, then it's not true. Now here, I'll be talking about this as we get a bit closer to Easter. Let's remind ourselves of Thomas, the disciple Thomas, much maligned. throughout history as Doubting Thomas. You've all heard that description. Not to me. To me, Thomas is a hero. Absolutely. For here was a man who refused to say that he understood what he did not understand, and that he believed what he did not believe. Good on him, I say. Good old Thomas. There is an uncompromising honesty about him. He was not the kind of man who would just rattle off a creed that was written hundreds, thousands of years ago without understanding what it's all about. Tennyson wrote in Memoriam, "There lives more faith in honest doubt, believe me," he says, "than in all the creeds." Somebody mentioned to me a few weeks ago in church that we didn't say the Lord's Prayer in this church. We're going to, but just like with the Bible readings, what we need to do is to spend some time thinking about the words and their meaning before we just spiel them off week on and week off. And we'll be doing that in the course of the next few weeks and months to consider that, so we have a real understanding of what we're saying. And so as we experience new things day in and day out, we also know that experience can change. Don't be tied down to what you might have believed last week or last year. Be open to ever evolving. We can change our minds. Yes, we can. New experiences and understandings come our way. And this way of thinking sometimes is described as process theology. There is no absolute, just process. And this is so unlike the church, which so often holds on to orthodoxy for fear that it might undermine its own status. A minister once said to me, "I can't preach what I actually believe, or I would be thrown out." That's how untruths are developed and grow. You have to have honesty and integrity. It's vital. And when you experience it yourselves, then it feels real, because for you it is real. I was conducting a children's address once in a church that had a group of kids at the front of the church, which is often the case, and the minister comes down and says a little homily or whatever to a group of bored kids before they go out to be equally bored in a schoolroom somewhere. But I was talking to the kids. And in the course of what I would do with children is not to say little stories, but what I want to do with children when I sit and talk to them is I want to understand their own experiences. As I'm talking to this group of kids, a 7-year-old girl near the front put her hand up and she said, "Minister, I want you to know that I'm no longer Sarah MacDonald." And I said, "Why?" She said, "I'm now Sarah McGee." And I said, "Why?" She said, "I've got a new dad, Jimmy McGee. He moved in last week." To which a kid on the third row said, "Oh, Jimmy McGee, we had him, he's rubbish." This young boy had found out for himself, hadn't he? And he wasn't afraid to say so. He's got a profound message for us all, I think. So we listen, yes, we view, yes, we read, but most of all, Find out for yourself. We will walk to the future with openness. Our hands are open to receive. Our hearts are open to give. Our minds long to learn. And our souls reach out to each other. This is our time to honor, to grow, and to share. And we are blessed.